Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to introduce Kalinda Reyna for opening remarks.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and welcome everyone. And thank you for joining our inaugural event for Data Privacy Week 2023, Data, the Story of You. The goal of today's event, and a lot of what we're doing this week, is to really raise awareness around the importance of data privacy and its role in our digital lives. We'll hear today from several professionals that I'm very excited for you all to listen to about how they incorporate data privacy into their own lives and how they think about it in their professional work lives as well. I'm excited that this is our sixth turn with National Cybersecurity Alliance and LinkedIn coming together to celebrate Data Privacy Week. We thank you all for coming and joining us each year that you have, and our ability to continue to bring really great speakers and content to help us celebrate this important week. I'd like to thank our platinum sponsor, Microsoft, and our silver sponsor, Optiv, for helping us make this all possible. And with that, I have the distinct honor of introducing our very first speaker this morning, Bill Weiser, who is the Colorado Attorney General. Attorney General Weiser serves as Colorado's 39th Attorney General, and before running for office, he had a very distinguished career as Dean of the University of Colorado Law School, and prior to that, he served as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the U.S. Department of Justice and as Senior Advisor for Technology and Innovation in the Obama administration's National Economic Council. He served on President Obama's transition team, overseeing the Federal Trade Commission, and previously served in President Bill Clinton's Department of Justice as Senior Counsel to the Attorney General in charge of the Antitrust Division, advising on telecommunication matters. Before his appointment at the Justice Department, Mr. Weiser served as a law clerk to Justices Byron R. White and Ruth Bader Ginsburg at the United States Supreme Court, and to Judge David Ebel at the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver, Colorado. And I have to apologize that I had to read that whole thing, but when I read it over to my daughter last night, she was very impressed, Phil. And we're really excited to hear from you today because we know that the Colorado has passed its Privacy Act, which will be coming into effect later this year. And so we are very delighted to be hearing from you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kalinda. Thanks everyone for joining us, and happy Data Privacy Week. I'm thrilled to be talking about why data privacy matters, and I appreciate our host at both LinkedIn and the National Cybersecurity Alliance for putting together this session that's really focused on how individuals can take charge of your data and why it matters. As Kalinda noted, I've been at this for a while, working at the federal, now the state level, and during that time, I've always been committed to this basic principle. Consumers should be in charge of their own data. Consumers have rights in their data, and it's the job of government to help protect consumers. And here at the Colorado Attorney General's office, this is a core commitment, which is partially why we worked hard to make Colorado the third state, for those keeping score, California and Virginia beat us to it, to establish comprehensive data privacy protections. We're proud of this work, and it's worth noting that the national data privacy story goes back to the early 70s. For those who are really wonky in this, you'll know that we have this Fair Information Privacy Practices concept. That is a construct that has guided us, including when I worked for President Obama on this Privacy Bill of Rights idea. It's just too bad that the federal government has not been able to act on an issue that has so much appeal across all lines, partisan, geographic, and otherwise. In Colorado, for example, our state Senate passed our law unanimously. We know this is a big issue, and we know that as a state, we are not perfectly situated to address it. Ideally, we would get a national solution that would also empower states to act. But we haven't seen evidence that we're going to get national policy, so states are stepping into this breach with what you might call a second best solution, or better to have individual state protections than no protections. It's worth noting that Colorado is working in tandem with other states like California, Virginia, to ensure our protections are interoperable. We are aware that companies have to face hard choices Do they follow California's model, Colorado's model? We want to make it so that it's not a conflict to comply with the laws of different states. We are doing this in a transparent way with a lot of public involvement. We've asked for comments. In fact, there's going to be another such opportunity. We're going to have a hearing even on February 1st. If you go to coag.gov/CPA, you can see the drafts of our proposed rules, feedback. We need your engagement. I often say our democracy is not a spectator sport, it's a team sport. I will tell you, comments we've gotten have absolutely influenced our thinking. And even when the Colorado Privacy Act goes into effect, July of 2023, that is not the end of our process of refining this protections. It's just one step along that journey, and we expect to have other processes that will further refine our rules. In terms of the timing, in July 2023, consumers are going to get some new rights in Colorado. You can access data collected about you. And if there's data collected that is inaccurate, kind of like your credit report, you can delete it. You can opt out of how your data is used. You can correct it if it's something that you find incorrect, and you can get access to it in a portable form. We recognize for both consumers and for businesses that we have some education to do, because a lot of people have not necessarily thought about data as something that they have control over. So we're going to lean into that work, and we're going to lean into the work of helping support other states that are now looking at these questions, ideally looking at Colorado's structure as a model. We want to make sure that, as I said, this is something that companies are baking into how they operate with this core commitment that they want to protect and honor consumers. We recognize it's a cultural change. It'll take some time. In terms of how we will focus on enforcement, I've often said we're not going to go after foot faults, if you will, for those tennis fans or for basketball fans, ticky-tack fouls. We're going to go after those who are engaging in what you might think about as willful noncompliance, those who are thumbing their nose at the rules, saying we don't care about consumers, we're not going to give them the privacy protections that Colorado law affords. We know there's a lot of questions out there. I'm happy to take a few now if we can pull this off. I think there's going to be some questions that people could submit in the chat, and I'm happy to address them. I should note we will have a in-person event for those in Colorado on Friday, talking about this effort that we're now working on. So those who are around could join us in person here at the Department of Law. All right, I got a first question, which is top 3 priorities for enforcement. I gave you the first one. When we know that there are companies that are engaging what I called willful noncompliance, saying I'm not going to bother following the law at all, that's our top priority. So I'll give you an example. Consumers have a right to say, what data are you collecting on me? And if a company says, pound sand, we're not going to give you that information, that's really problematic, because that's a company saying, I'm not trying to comply with the law, I am ignoring the law. And so that's where we're going to put our efforts. And you can see on our webpage I mentioned, past privacy enforcement. Companies need to take this seriously. This is a real important cultural shift for companies, and we want companies to take it seriously. We also have some other requirements that I want to mention. Data assessments. Companies have a responsibility to regularly ask, how am I storing data? How long am I keeping the data? To keep regular data hygiene is something companies need to take seriously. And we are going to, again, educate companies on this and make sure they're following our law. Question from Liz, what's the difference between Colorado and California? And this is a question that I guess we have to say is a work in progress, because both California and us here in Colorado are working on regulations. And one big question will be how maybe some different issues will land in the 2 states, which is a nice segue into Kevin's question, which is, how can you give us an example of data interoperability? The short version is, insofar as California may adopt let's say, a prescriptive requirement, if we are adopting a requirement, how can we adopt it perhaps at a level of generality where compliance could include what California said, but would not necessarily require what California said? What we don't want to do is California's got one prescriptive requirement and we have another one such that you can't do both. And in general, I have a certain level of concern that if we're overly prescriptive in our rules, that may not necessarily keep up with technological change and progress. And so that is a additional concern that I've talked about. I gave a speech a year ago or so at IAPP, and I talked about our commitment to allowing technological change and innovation. And we don't want to adopt regulations or other rules that would undermine these important forms of progress. Speaking of progress, they also ask, how does this protection of privacy and data relate to AI? Well, one important point that's worth noting, if data is collected about people and analyzed using AI, more and more opportunities may get shut off to people without them knowing it. And if inaccurate data is collected and analyzed, you may have opportunities shut off inaccurately. So your data portfolio, as collected by different companies, has a, let's call it, feature that is not unlike your credit report. It will get used and analyzed that will either afford you or potentially prevent you from having opportunities. We want to make sure that those changes, to the extent they happen in the marketplace, are fair, are protecting consumers, and consumers are not merely, let's call it, on the menu, but they're at the table. They have some sovereignty to say, you know what, I'm out. I don't want you collecting my data. Or, hey, the data you think you have about me is wrong. So one question that Travis mentions, which is a whole nother topic for conversation. How can we have adaptable regulation in a world that is technologically dynamic? I've written articles on this topic. And the short version is, I mentioned before, prescriptive rules that are potentially more fixed as opposed to guideposts that have a little more play in the joints. How do we give room for companies, for trusted intermediaries to develop strategies? One big topic that we'll be talking about is universal opt-out, for example, where people can say, as a consumer, I'm out, not just for you, but for others, and that has to be respected. We know that developing this regime, if you will, is not easy, because whatever may make sense today may be different a year from now. And that's something that we want to make sure we are building in and baking into the regime. So as we adopt our requirements, we work to adopt them in a way that allows that flexibility, that play in the joints, so that we're not getting in the way of technological change. All right, I have time for a final question. I am almost at the limit. And without any, let me make the following pitch. I often make the case, and here we are sponsored by LinkedIn, so I'll give a big shout out to your founder. Reid Hoffman wrote a book called The Startup of You, which means everyone has to be an entrepreneur in yourself. Everyone has to take control of their destiny. In this case, that means both digital hygiene and digital awareness. As you develop a presence online, you're sharing information about yourself. You may not even realize it. You need to start thinking hard about what information you're sharing with who. Who's collecting it? What are they doing with it? Under Colorado, we've got clear rights for consumers, where consumers can be in the driver's seat, and we have clear messages for companies. You've got to take this data collection process seriously, recognizing the impact it can have on real people. So that's a lot for people to think about. It is a new change. We're going to work hard to educate consumers, educate companies. Please keep an eye on what Colorado's doing. And for those of you who are in Colorado, come join us on Friday on Data Privacy Day, when we'll talk about this in person at the Department of Law. You can learn more about us at coag.gov. You can also follow me on different platforms to hear what I'm up to as Colorado Attorney General. So with that, I'll kick it back.
Great. Thank you so much, Attorney General Weiser, for joining us today. And now, please welcome Larry Magid, President and CEO of ConnectSafely.org and panelist for Protecting Your Family's Story.
Thank you very much, and pleasure to hear from you, General. I'd like to begin with just a couple of remarks, and then I'm going to introduce the panel. And we're talking about data privacy. And though it is related, it is somewhat different from personal privacy, at least in the sense of how it's revealed. So when it comes to privacy, there are things we need to do to protect ourselves from hackers, and frankly, to protect ourselves from businesses and website operators and other organizations that we might be interacting with. And we're going to talk a lot about how you can do that, and also the responsibility of companies to protect your data and not disclose it and not allow it to be leaked. But there's also another personal type of privacy that especially applies to everyone, including young people, and that's what we say online, what we blurt out on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or any other platform we might use, or for that matter, what we share in text and email. And we need to keep both of those in mind, because no matter how good your security is, no matter how responsible the companies you interact with may be, if you're out there saying things that you shouldn't be saying, disclosing private personal information like social security numbers, credit card numbers, or anything that is confidential, it really doesn't matter what protections are in place. So keep that in mind. And one other thing I'd like to address just briefly is a myth that young people don't care about privacy. I hear that a lot, but actually there's been some surveys on this. And what we find out is that young people do care about privacy, only they have a different perspective than most of us adults do. We adults tend to worry about businesses and government getting access to our information. Young people tend to worry about parents and educators getting access to their information. And if you think about it, it has to do with who's in charge, authorities. We all worry about authorities somehow getting information about us. And the authorities for young people are not so much government and businesses as they are parents and teachers. Now, of course, everyone needs to worry about hackers and criminals. But with that as a background, I want to introduce my panel, our panel, and get into the discussion. We have Kevin Van Klooster, who is Data Protection Officer of Snap, which of course is the parent company of Snapchat. We have Bailey Sanchez, who's the Policy Counsel and Youth Education Privacy for the Future of Privacy Forum. And my friend Kalinda Reyna, who's the Head of Privacy at LinkedIn. Thank you so much all for joining us. I want to begin with Kevin. Why is this an important issue?
Thanks, Larry, and welcome everyone to Data Privacy Week. It's an honor to be here today. I think this is an important issue because childhood is a special protected time in which children should get the opportunity to grow, learn, play, develop, and flourish with dignity. And these are not just my fancy words. This is set out in the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. And unlike us, I think today children grow up online and are sharing more data than ever. So many of us experience this transition from an analog to a digital world, and we still feel some sort of distance between our online and offline personas. But new generations are digitally native, and this online-offline distinction is much more blurry, if it exists at all. So we know children are more online, are sharing more data, and although they may be well versed in technology, they don't have the same wisdom or life experience that help them make the right judgment calls. And like adults, children make mistakes, but the issue is that these past mistakes can now haunt children well into adulthood and influence the level of comfort they experience in expressing themselves. So I think data privacy plays a crucial role here in protecting children and creating an environment where children can make mistakes, learn from them, and not be haunted by their past actions. So one of the most effective ways I think we could do this is by not storing data, or if we do store data, only store it for short periods of time, and foster an environment that's more akin to the real world, enables free expression instead of creating these permanent records. And we overroll to play here, starting with the companies that collect this data.
Thanks, Kevin. You know, if I could inject another question, perhaps for you, Kevin, or maybe other people can answer it. One of the things that both delights me and frustrates me are these new rules, largely coming out of Europe, that require companies to get disclosures and get permission about cookies. That's a great thing. But on the other hand, it's really confusing to me sometimes when I'm asked and given all these choices and essentially burdened by having to make some decisions. And half the time it's just easier to say, accept all and move on, which is not the right answer. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that as to what we as consumers could do better, and maybe whether the regulations should be written in a different way.
Thank you so much for this question. And I'm European, so I live in the US, but I grew up with these cookie banners, and it's so frustrating. And even as a privacy professional, depending on the website I go to, I just hit approve, and it's. I know I sometimes try and read them and go to more settings, but most websites use dark patterns, and they make it very difficult for you to just select the settings you want. And so, out of laziness, I tend to just approve the cookies. But I think don't do what I'm doing. I'm making mistakes, but actually look at, hey, do you trust the website? What do you want to share? Go to more settings. And if a website is not offering a cookie banner if a website has these dark patterns, flag it to your regulator, because that means they're violating privacy legislation, and there's something you can do about that as a consumer.
Yeah, the only thing more frustrating is when you have to do an unsubscribe and the text for the word unsubscribe is so small that you need new glasses to be able to see it.
Or the link's broken.
And Larry, if I could just add in there, I think this points to one of the issues we have with regulations that actually Attorney General Weiser was referring to, which is this technology shifting. The law doesn't often keep up. And so what was maybe potentially a very useful choice 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when the e-privacy directive came into play, which was around saying no to cookies, today is so fundamental to the way technology works that many of us, Kevin, I'm in your camp too, just click, accept all, because you need to move on. You need to get the data. We all know there's a risk involved in that, but that's part of how we are living our lives today. And so what we need laws to do is to give consumers choices that make sense. And also, as I think to Kevin's point, have companies making decisions that are thinking about their users and not just about what's the easiest way to hide the unsubscribe.
Yeah, a really good point.
Yeah,
It's
can
another.
I tack on as well?
Sure.
Yeah, so I think maybe the question isn't even should I accept cookies or not, but consumers should maybe reframe it to think about what personal information am I comfortable giving to a website or service, especially because I think the cookie question is less useful on mobile apps. And I know that increasingly families and particularly kids are spending less time on websites and more time on mobile apps. So I think it would be helpful to shift our thinking a bit less about accept cookies or not accept cookies, but maybe think of it as do I want to give this personal information? Does this service need it in order for me to use this service? Do they need some personal information, but perhaps not the correct information? Like, do you have to provide your birth date to use that service? So I think it would be helpful to just generally think about like, what information am I giving online and what am I comfortable with?
It brings up the broader issue. Even though I'm very supportive of government being involved in protecting consumers, government tends to work at glacial speeds and technology companies tend to work at very fast speeds. And sometimes a very well-meaning piece of legislation can be out of date by the time the proverbial ink is dry. Bailey, on this very point, let's talk a little bit about how people can make good decisions and make the most out of their apps and accounts and resources, while at the same time limiting the data they share.
Yeah, so just to continue to tack on to that previous point I made, you should always ask yourself, what does a website or a service need, and know where you can maybe provide inaccurate or incomplete information. So when you're playing a game online, the game might not need your real name, might not need your real birth date. And I think with that, it's just important to keep in mind that even basic information could be sensitive and should be protected. And then going along with that, just to be aware of the default settings. There's actually a period of time years ago where my Facebook statuses got set to all public, and I had no idea for like months. And so when I was posting, I thought I was posting just for my friends. And so that wasn't even part of my thought process was, is this something I want to share publicly or not? So again, like it can happen to me. I am still in my 20s, I'm fairly digital native, but even me, like I can get tripped up on those default settings. So just making sure that you're aware of what the default settings are when you engage with a service.
So just to be clear, you're not under oath when you're typing into a web page. You are saying that sometimes stretching the truth to protect yourself may be okay. So
yeah, and sometimes it may even be quicker. Like my birthday, it's one of the last options, and it's quicker for me to just put January 1st. 1990 or something like that.
Okay, I'm not going to comment on that. Kalinda, let's talk about parents. You do a lot of work with parents. You are a parent, and I know you've got a great video series on YouTube, unrelated to your job. It's still very important in terms of youth safety. Where do parents sometimes go wrong when it comes to data privacy in their kids and their families?
I think it's just such a different way of parenting today, Larry, than it was when I was a kid. And I think the hard things are we focus a lot on screen time limits, and I'd say look at the quality of your time, of your child's time online, rather than just the quantity. Because actually, my kids come home from school every day, and the first thing they do is get their iPads. They have 20 minutes on their iPads, and that time is actually not allowed to be games, but they have to look at the news. We do all of our usage of devices in public spaces in our home, which makes it a lot harder for kids to tell you they're doing something that they are maybe not. So there's no devices allowed in rooms or behind closed doors, which means that I do have the ability to walk by and see, are you really reading the news, and do a little quiz. So that's one thing I think to keep in mind. I think the other thing is it's not possible. I talk to a lot of parents who are like, well, I am just not going to allow my kids to use technology. And the problem is you can't control that once they get into school, because today technology is completely integrated into our education system. Unfortunately, we have a lot of schools who don't have the resources to have someone there telling them, what data you shouldn't be collecting from those students, what protections you should write into the contracts you do with providers who are working with your school, how to assess different apps and their security and their protections. Those things don't exist today for most schools. And even here in the Silicon Valley, I know my child's school doesn't have those resources either. So I think it puts a huge burden on us as parents to really try to be on top of what is happening in the home, what is happening in the school, what might be happening at a friend's house. And it's hard. It's really almost impossible to manage. So my advice to parents is to be talking to our kids more about this. This is a piece of parenting that my parents' age, and some of us on here's parents' age, didn't have to talk to their kids about. But in the 80s, there was a lot of warnings about don't talk to strangers. If someone's offering you candy, don't go over to the van and take the candy, right? We need to have those kind of conversations with our kids for the modern world about, don't share this data unless you need to, as Bailey was saying. Understanding if you put just a name out there and another piece of identifying information, that your child can be, their location could be figured out, other information about them could be figured out. So I think it's really important for all of us as parents to really start talking to our kids about tech and how to manage it.
Well, first of all, Kalinda, I want to thank you for giving me an irresistible opportunity to plug two resources on Connect Safely. One is the Parent's Guide to Student Data Privacy, and the other is the Educator's Guide to Student Data Privacy, which, by the way, we collaborated with the Future of Privacy Forum on those documents, on those guides. So we would strongly agree with you that it's important for parents to educate themselves about all aspects of privacy, including what schools are doing with their students' information. And Bailey, let's talk a little bit from your perspective at the Future Privacy Forum about what industry is doing or should be doing to protect young people's privacy.
Sure. So part of my job at the Future Privacy Forum is to do legislative tracking. And in the last couple of years, kids' privacy has really been like a concern and an interest of lawmakers, parents, and really like the news cycle. So we've seen a strong focus on like regulating or really doing something about kids' online experiences. And I think the doing something is intentionally a vague phrase that I've chosen because it can take a lot of different directions. There's that screen time debate that's always popping up. That's like, should kids even be engaging with these services or going online? There's also some concern focused on like content moderation and harms and preventing kids from seeing certain types of content. But there's also been a big focus on kids' privacy and data protection. So we are seeing lawmakers seek to regulate kids' privacy and really taking a broader approach to that traditional model of under 13. I think a lot of us are familiar that a lot of websites require you to be 13 to sign up. 13 is the age that we've had for several decades in the US. But I think there's a growing concern and thought that teens deserve privacy protections too, and that's something that FPF is certainly in favor of. But the teen privacy might look different from kids' privacy, and then you have to really grapple with these questions of, okay, what role does the parent serve in that? So I think what we're seeing an acknowledgement that we should do more than what we have been doing on kids' privacy and really kids and teens' privacy. So there might be more to come on the legislation fronts in the next year or two. You might see some changes to sites and services. But then also companies we're seeing are proactively really introducing resources, tools for both the kids and the parents. And I think maybe Kevin can speak to that part a bit.
Before Kevin chimes in, I want to make a comment. Maybe anybody here can address it. Obviously, what you're saying is very important, that we need to think about how we protect teens' privacy. But there's a tension between protection and freedom. One way to protect teens' privacy would be to kick them off the internet. Obviously, nobody's talking about that. But social media is a form of speech. So if you ban any person, regardless of their age, from social media, you're basically banning them from both contributing to a conversation and benefiting from a conversation. And even the issue of parental rights starts to sometimes butt up with children's rights. There are cases where parents and children have different attitudes about sexual orientation, about religion, about politics. And there are parents who either fail to act in terms of allowing their children online, or refuse to act because they disagree with their teenagers. I'm not so much talking about younger children, but certainly if you look at some people like Malala or Greta, some of the major leaders in our world, they could be banned from expressing themselves online if there were laws that prohibited people under 16, for example, to access social media without parental permission. Any thoughts on that?
I completely agree, Larry, and it's why I raised the freedom of expression in my opening remarks. So I think privacy can foster freedom of expression, and I think oftentimes I think that currently there's a lot of focus on safety and online privacy, but we're forgetting some of the other fundamental human rights that are laid out in the UN Convention for the Rights of the Child, including freedom of expression. And I think it's a holistic view. Kalinda.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that. I think, as a parent of 3 kids, and this is why I'm so into this issue as something side to my work life. And I do talk about this on a YouTube channel I have called Raising the Digital Future, is the struggle for us as parents is weighing that privacy and freedom, right? And I think that as children develop, that's our job as parents, to be balancing that and giving back some more of that freedom. But the problem we have today is not enough of us parents are talking to our kids about what it means to post something online. So it's great when it's Greta who's talking about, in the environmental crisis, but what do you do with the average 15-year-old boy who may not be posting about that, right? And may not understand the implications for them in the future when they're applying to colleges, when they're looking for jobs, when they're out in the world and someone's first reaction to them is Googling something that they did 10 years ago. Yeah. So I think that is, really privacy to me is fostering freedom, giving people the ability to take away some of the information. As Kevin was saying at the very beginning, more data being deleted is a benefit in many ways for our kids, so that they can grow and develop into the people they want to be without having an online history that holds them back.
Yeah.
And yeah, Larry, I would just say, I think your comment is definitely well taken. And I think that's partially why we haven't cracked the code on how do we protect kids online, but also allow them to express themselves. And that is really, to some extent, what's animating the debate. And I think that there's a lot of hard questions. And to some extent, we're going to have to figure out what trade-offs are we comfortable making. But that's why I think in the meantime, there are companies that are really trying to proactively introduce, certain default settings for teenagers, different types of accounts depending on how old you are. And then also we're seeing a lot of like companies introduce like parental like education tools so that parents can have those discussions with their kids.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Kevin, you're at Snap, and I have to say, as well as Instagram and some other companies, have gotten away from the strict parental control model where the parents can basically lock up the child's device and control it and access everything, to more of a parental, I don't know, supervision, management, permission based, where the child or the young person, teen, has to actually has to give permission to the parent in order for them to essentially help manage their settings. I'm curious why you went that route.
Yeah, let me take one step back before answering the question, and it goes to Kalinda's point. Sometimes we laugh about like, oh, the warnings in the 80s, but we have centuries of ethics and values that we've established, and like throwing away all that experience just because we're now operating in a digital world, I think is frankly stupid. And there's a lot we can learn, and we've moved very fast in the last 2 decades. I think maybe it's a time to pause and see what what are the values that we established and why did they work for centuries, right? And so with Snapchat, we try to think of the real world, and in our product discussions with policy, with engineers, we always think about like the real life implications. So when we were developing Family Center, we didn't want this strict control-based model, but we were thinking of a dinner table conversation. So your kids come home from school, and one of the first questions you ask them is like, oh, what did you do today? Who were you playing with? And so we tried to take that dinner conversation and figure out how we can apply that to a family center. So instead of showing the actual conversation, we show who your child was interacting with. Of course, this is consent from both the kid and the parent need to consent to see this. But we think that's striking a really clear balance between oversight and not insight into what they're actually saying. We've got great feedback from the community, and we work with 50 plus outside stakeholders to get to this, and it's very it's fascinating.
Kevin, I'd say my 14-year-old thanks you very much because of that feature, I allowed him to download Snap. So I do think the work that you guys are doing to think through how to help, especially your main base of teenagers and parents, come together is extremely helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I agree. So now is my favorite part. We have just about a little more than 10 minutes left. Let's talk about 15. Let's talk about some ideas. What can parents do to help their families? And for that matter, even what can kids do? I don't know if there are any kids watching, but often kids have really good advice to their parents when it comes to privacy and security. And let's add security in there also, because as you know, you can't have privacy without security. What can parents do to really help their families have a more private and more secure experience when they're online? And I'll open that up to anybody who wants to jump in.
Kevin, you want to go first?
Sure. I love the Attorney General's closing remarks on hygiene and technological hygiene. And when we were discussing this, maybe we use January or this week as a day to like check your settings. I actually checked some of the settings of my apps this morning before this call, and I was surprised by some of the default settings that I still had in place. So start there and take. You have agency, and Larry, you said there's no privacy if you hold all these big themes. You're sharing new data every single day, and every single day you can control what you're sharing.
And Kevin, to that point, I'll add, I think that's a great step for everyone to do is to check your settings. I'd also say go through and look through what apps you've downloaded onto your phone and see how many of them you are actually using and how many of them you are not. And also for those that are, apps that you have to log into, they're often designed for you to forget that you've logged in. So if you don't log out of the app, they can continue running in the background and gathering data. So that's something to think about. But I also would encourage parents, it's not a perfect solution. When I was at Apple, we designed the family settings, but I think both Android and iPhone now have family settings. And if you are a family with, multiple devices from the same company that are connected, it is really helpful to use those settings as a way to manage what's going on in your home. I check those settings to make sure that each each of my kids at different ages, so 14, 11, and 7, are asking me permission for what apps they can download. We have different screen time limits for different kids. And I think those are one way to help parents have some oversight, because when your kid hits their screen time limit, I know I did say before, don't restrict yourself to just focusing on screen time limit. But for my 7-year-old, it's really helpful when she comes to me and says, I've hit my limit. And then there's a great conversation about, well, what were you doing for the full hour that you had with that? So.
Yeah, I think my tip would be more on the Internet of Things side. So knowing what sensors are introduced into your space or spaces of people in your life. I think this will help you answer that question of, if a connected device gets hacked, is there a camera feed associated with that, a microphone? Can they know when you're home or not? I know this was a very active conversation for me and my partner when we were picking out a baby monitor, because I am also a parent, but a parent of a toddler. So a lot of the discussions that Kalinda has flagged, we are not at that stage yet, but there were a lot of baby monitors out there, and then a lot of people recommending like, oh, get this device, like just this like security camera, and use that as a baby monitor. So really thinking through, like, should you use a device that was designed for a different purpose for something else, and how that might have unintended consequences. Someone at FPF, they, I think, got like smart Christmas lights, and they were like, okay, after thinking through, I think the risk of hacking, what could happen, is relatively low, because, like, even if that is a harm or risk that you're concerned about, just really like playing out that scenario, like, okay, like a hacker hacked into my Christmas lights, like, so what? Like, what would happen? And so I think getting comfortable with like what your level of risk tolerance is. And I think another tip I have that's small but impactful is really to cast a broader net of what you mean by family, and maybe including grandparents in a lot of these conversations.
Wow.
Because, when me and my child get to this stage where we have like screen time limits and best practices for how he will utilize apps, that could all go out the window when he goes to grandma's house.
Yeah.
And again, like my grandparents, like also like my grandfather's had his Facebook hacked. So just even like just best practices for your whole family, I think it's a great conversation to have.
Bailey, I just want to chime in on that really quick, because it is one of the hardest things about parenting, which is not just what you think, but what your partner in the family also thinks about sharing online. Yeah. And then your own parents and your in-laws and all the other people who want to share the pictures of your new child. That is one of the hard, Bailey, you're at that hard stage where everyone's like, what's the harm? We'll share 20 pictures of your kid because I want all my friends to see them on Facebook. And you're like, we're trying really hard not to do that. So I think, Bailey, you pointed out such an important thing for new parents, which is really having that conversation with everyone, including when you go to things like preschools or to birthday parties and have to say, we're not comfortable with all these pictures of our kids going up. I think that's an important thing. And then the one other tip I'd say for parents at Bailey's stage and younger is talking constantly with your children when you're using tech around them, so they understand what you're doing. Because if you are a parent just using an iPhone in front of a 1 or 2-year-old, they're not going to understand that you're doing work. They're going to think you're always doing something entertaining. And so to help them understand what their relationship needs to be with tech, it's important to describe how you're using the phone in front of them. So mommy's doing work right now, and I'm going to be done in X amount of time, and then we're going to focus back on you. Or, we're going to use this to call grandma and grandpa, and then we're going to turn it off. It's important to talk to them through how technology is happening for them.
Right. May I add one thing? And it goes back to the parents' guides. So Larry, you mentioned the parents' guide that Connect Safely has. A lot of the apps that you use also have parents' guides. I know Snap has one, and that's a really good conversation starter. Download the app, get familiar with the technology, and maybe your children will even want to demonstrate, like, oh, this is how you take a snap, or this is how, and by playing and learning, I think that's the best way to build a relationship and also get more familiar with the technology.
Absolutely. And in addition to the guides that are done by Snap and other companies, Connect Safely has guides to virtually any service that your child is likely to use as well. Bailey, I was kind of laughing when you're talking about the Christmas lights. I actually got a security bulletin from the maker of my air fryer. As it turns out, I've got a Wi-Fi equipped air fryer, and the danger that you worry about is it can become a vector. I'm not so much worried somebody taking over my air fryer, but could it become a vector to take over my network? I never know whether that's a real threat or an imagined threat. And that brings up a broader question, which is that I have friends who are, I don't want to say paranoid, and I don't want to say conspiracy theorists, but boy, do they worry about things that just don't really worry me. Like, is Google listening to everything I say through my Android phone? Because it turned out one time they were having a conversation and then they got an ad with something similar to what they were talking about. Or, if I go online, will the IRS be watching me? All of these questions that actually are suppressing their ability to take advantage of some of the great technologies, or at least creating anxiety if they are taking. So what would you say to the people who are hyper worried about their privacy?
Bailey, I'd love your thoughts on this one, because I honestly get that question all the time, Larry. The one of I was talking about something and then I saw an ad about it.
Yeah,
I think that's actually due to people's searching behaviors or what they are doing, and it's creating a trail, and then they're connecting that to the fact that they talked about it in front of a device. I mean, I know from my time at Apple that these devices are typically designed to record a certain period of time and then drop that data, but they need to be on to be hearing whether they're being called. So, hey Siri or hey Alexa, they have to know that they're being called. So they have to be
my Alexa light just went on, by the way. Thank you very much. So she is listening. Right
now. So they have to do that. But whether they are actually taking that and doing what they are recording as a snippet to determine if they should be on, I highly doubt they are using that to advertise directly.
You're not doing it.
Yeah. Okay. So
your battery would drain. It's way too expensive.
Right? It doesn't make sense.
It's not happening. No.
Bailey, what do you guys?
Well, yeah, and if you think about it, like, it would be so hard to listen to everything you say.
Alexa, stop! I have to. Literally, you guys have been triggering my echo. Can you hear it in the background? It's going nuts. Stop, Alexa, go away. Thank you.
Yeah, if you think about it, it'd be really hard to parse through all of the, like, if your device was recording you, they'd have to, someone would have to listen back and figure out what is most relevant to then plug in to serve you an ad. So I think playing out that scenario, I think the cost benefit analysis for a company would probably not be too much. It's actually a really great Reply All episode about this exact question that they explored. But in terms of like practical tips, or what I might say to a privacy, like a hyper aware privacy person, I think there's some like practical things they can do. You can always use like DuckDuckGo or like one of those search engines. There's also ad and tracking blockers like Privacy Badger, EFF, and Common Sense Media have some great resources on this. And then also just keeping in mind, not all tracking is detrimental to privacy. Tracking can also be used to monitor the performance of websites. But it is tricky to strike that balance of someone who is hyper-focused on privacy, but maybe has swung a bit further in the other direction.
And often those same people, by the way, are jeopardizing their privacy in other ways. Yes. So they're so hyper-focused, but they're saying things on Facebook, for example, which perhaps they shouldn't be saying. So, you need to put some, there are things you can control and things you can't as well. Yeah. Any other thoughts about that for that community? Because they're out there. I mean, I have a couple of friends that call me all the time with these bizarre concerns that, bother them.
I also think we all think that we're very like unique, but we're pretty predictable. We're probably in a certain bucket, maybe the privacy centric bucket, and that's how they get those ads. But yeah, be aware and don't be like me and click approval, because you're leaving cookie crumbs across the internet. So
the one question I have though is, if Google and these other sites are smart enough to know what I'm shopping for, why aren't they smart enough to know that I already bought it and I'm no longer in the market for whatever it is they keep trying to sell me?
That's a great question. And that would probably because you're not accepting all cookies and you're being diligent, Larry.
Okay.
Or you didn't click on the ad to buy it.
Yeah.
So
That could be.
Yeah.
They just won't let go. Any other thoughts before we get into our final couple of minutes where I'm going to ask everybody to talk about resources that they want to share with people? Okay. Well, let's talk about resources. I introduced you guys and mentioned your companies, or organizations, but I didn't get into much detail. I know Kalinda, LinkedIn is focused entirely with adults, but obviously a lot of adults are watching this. So why don't we start with you and talk about what resources LinkedIn has, and perhaps even some tools that LinkedIn might offer to help people protect their privacy.
Yeah, thanks for that. And we do allow 16 and up. That is a requirement. And we have settings that I encourage folks to go to, pretty detailed settings that allow you to figure out what you're comfortable sharing or not sharing. There's a difference between, public, making something public, which means it could potentially be found in a Google search, because part of what LinkedIn's trying to do is help you be found. And a lot of people go to Google to find someone's name, and then they're able to click on and see their profile, but they won't get all the details unless you've chosen to make it public. So I would say take a look at your settings. It's a really important thing to do. At LinkedIn, privacy is part of our overall corporate principles. So every 2 weeks, we have a all hands, and amongst that are our core operating principles, one of which is trust. And we talk about these issues a lot, and it is something that we expect every employee at the company to take seriously, and that we build into the product, rather than having to put all the onus on the consumer, but to try to build it into the product so that some of that's taken away. And I think that's the way a lot of companies are starting to think, is really embracing that concept of how do we use some of what's happening in privacy enhancing technologies today to take away some of the identifiable data, but still get the value out of the data that you need as a business. So, and deleting data, minimizing what you collect, all of those are things that are beginning to take real hold in, I think, a lot of the tech companies, and especially here at LinkedIn, it's something, the way we have been designing since I joined. So I would say those are some great tips. I would say for parents, if you are interested, there is a lot of great tips that I'm sure Bailey can share, but Common Sense Media is a great site for trying to understand what's okay for your kids and the age ranges that they're at. I have a YouTube channel, Raising the Digital Future, that can be helpful. And I know we've got a lot of other really great resources that Kevin and Bailey can speak to as well.
So we only have about 2 minutes left. So let's go with Kevin. Thank you for putting up that slide. Kevin, let's talk about what Snap is doing and resources that you might have to offer.
I'll be very quick. And one of the exciting things is we created a video that explains our privacy practices. It's available at values.snap.com, which is our new privacy and safety hub, where we combine our privacy and safety materials. We really think safety and privacy go hand in hand. That's why we combined the two. And on that website, you'll also will find our family center materials. And I want to plug a special lens that we're doing with FPF for Data Privacy Day. So if you open your Snapchat app on Saturday, you'll see the FPF Snap lens, which will provide cybersecurity and privacy tips to anyone who uses it.
Bailey?
I always have a lot of fun with that, Kevin. And then Kalinda, I actually took a look at your YouTube channel yesterday. I thought it was great because the videos were so concise. Because if there's one thing parents are short on, it's time. And any resource should be bite-sized and digestible and impactful. So I wanted to plug, FPF actually has an initiative called studentprivacycompass.org, where we have a lot of resources for educators, lawmakers, and folks that work at school districts. But what's most, I think, useful for families and consumers is our monthly newsletter, where we curate relevant news on youth and education privacy. And within that newsletter, we include resources that might be useful to families and plug any resources from FPF. So I think that would also speak to Larry's point of trying to cipher through like what are the hyper-aware privacy people versus what are the people that aren't paying attention at all. Like, we are doing the work of curating what we think is most worth your time.
Great. Well, thank you all. And in terms of Connect Safely, we're the official U.S. host of Safer Internet Day. That comes up Tuesday, February 7th. I guess that's was 2 weeks from today, or it is. You can find out a lot more about that at connectsafely.org. And we are doing on the evening, 7:30 Eastern on February 7th, we're having a live virtual event that you can participate in, co-sponsored with National PTA. And we also have resources so families can have their own Safer Internet Day event at home using our resources. I want to thank our panelists and thank the audience and thank everybody who helped create this product, this service, this program, and wishing everybody a very happy Data Privacy Week. Thanks again.
Thank you for that, Larry. And I want to give just one last plug that we will be co-hosting another event for Data Privacy Week, Designing a Privacy First World, this Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern. We will hope to see you all there. And thank you so much, everyone.
Take care.